Hello. So I want to talk a bit about mood and recovery because mood does play a big role in wanting to recover and in managing to recover as well. And in the article that I read recently, which I'll reference in the details below this video, the authors describe how individuals with anorexia experience a lack of motivation to recover when feeling distressed in some way. And that makes sense. It's incredibly difficult to recover from an eating disorder, and it's really hard to even want to recover, especially when you're feeling down or distressed in some way. And those distressed feelings that someone's having could be linked to environmental circumstances such as moving house. They could be linked to previous emotional trauma like sexual abuse, or they could also be linked to the eating disorder, because it is true that eating disorders do have an impact on mood, but it's also, I think, important not to rule out the opposite relationship where eating disorders are actually a coping strategy for low mood or anxiety or something like that. What was really interesting as well in the article is that even when those triggering events could be identified, it didn't really help. It was the experience of the ongoing misery, the experience of feeling sad, feeling anxious, feeling distressed, that prevented those people with eating disorders from wanting to get better. And I know from my own recovery that my mood and my emotions have played a huge role throughout and prior to the development of my eating disorder. I suffered with low mood, and I think my eating disorder, when it developed to a stage that was more intense, I suppose, sort of gave me some relief from the pervasive sense of worthlessness and the horrible depressive thoughts that I experienced, because all I could focus on was food and exercise, and there wasn't much room in my brain for thinking of anything else. And so my mind was briefly taken away from berating myself for things that I had done wrong or done poorly. And I also got this weird sense of satisfaction at the end of the day when I hadn't eaten a lot, which I've heard other people with eating disorders describe as well. It's sort of like a dopamine hit or a little high that you get at the end of the day. That's when you haven't eaten, that's associated with anorexia, and that sort of keeps the eating disorder going. And I guess it felt like even if I'd screwed everything else up, then at least I still had that one accomplishment, that was succeeding at my eating disorder, which is not something to be proud of, and I'm not going to say more about that. It's obviously a very disordered way of thinking, because being successful at having an eating disorder isn't a success, it's an illness. So I remember also when I went through a relapse with my eating disorder, I had absolutely no motivation to keep my eating disorder at bay. I could tell that it was getting worse. I couldn't be bothered. I couldn't muster up the energy to really care about myself, to really care that my eating disorder was totally taking over. At that time, it felt like everything had sort of fallen apart. I'd had these plans for graduate school, and I'd moved overseas for it, and then within 2 weeks I realised that it wasn't going to work out, and I was on a scholarship and I had to stick it out for at least that semester, or otherwise I'd have to pay back a huge fee. And my living situation was also very hard to deal with. It was very cramped, it was dirty, and loud, and although I did make some friends, I still felt quite lonely, as is often the nature of having an eating disorder. It's quite a lonely existence. I stuck it out for the semester, but I didn't care that my eating disorder was getting really bad, and I had no motivation to try and get myself to recover at that point. But I did know that at some point, if I didn't die, which I didn't, I would probably need to try recovery, which is what I did. And on my return home, I returned to eating disorder treatment, which of course I'm very privileged to be able to access treatment in the first place. But the treatment was the same as it had always been, and the reason that I really relapsed to begin with was because I hadn't actually reached a good place in my recovery when I moved overseas. I thought that I had sort of reached recovery as good as it was going to get, but I hadn't. Treatment when I returned was the same as it had been, which is to eat first, focus on nourishing your body, and then we'll deal with your mood, because right now with your eating disorder you're not in your right mind, and we can't help you work through that until you're nourishing your body. And I can totally understand and see that perspective, because there was at that time a lot of eating disorder in my brain. I really tried my best to follow that approach. I tried to eat decent portions and really force myself to eat. But every time that I ate to satisfaction, I would be absolutely overcome with sadness, with anxiety, definitely more sadness rather than the anxiety, and I think that is quite normal in eating disorder recovery to a point. The thoughts after I had eaten were not so much about the food, about what I'd just eaten. It was just about how it was sort of like as soon as I had satisfied my hunger, very temporarily, my mind freed up a little bit, and suddenly all these awful depressive thoughts came flooding in, and I had no idea how to deal with those, because I had used my eating disorder for years as a way to block out those thoughts almost completely, and my mood would drop really severely. And it is true that eating disorders themselves are associated with low mood, and that once the eating disorder is resolved, perhaps the low mood will also naturally resolve itself. But I already knew from my first attempt at recovery that that hadn't been the case, that I'd gained weight and my low mood had persisted. I'm incredibly grateful to have had, after several months of trying to feed myself and feeling incredibly distressed, I'm really grateful that I had access to a psychiatrist who recognised that I had probably dealt with depression for a long time, including prior to my eating disorder, and prescribed antidepressant medication, which made a huge difference to my recovery. And not only that, but I also made a decision to really be honest with my parents, who I was living with and still live with now, about my recovery and about how I was feeling. And I think both of those two things really helped hugely in regulating my mood and enabling me to recover. The antidepressants stopped me from plunging so far into darkness after eating. It was still hard, of course, but it felt more doable. And talking with my parents just I mean, talking, it helps, right? It usually helps. And they didn't get things perfect all the time, far from it sometimes, but just having people to listen as I could talk loud and try to rationalize my thoughts and what I was feeling was really helpful. And even if I wasn't talking to them, I would try and rationalize using my journal or even using YouTube videos or just simply talking to myself. So definitely I understand how feelings of distress, sadness, really intense feelings can hold you back from recovery, but they should not hold you back. I think my case is an example that sometimes the weight restore before counselling approach does not always work. I think sometimes you can't focus solely on the eating and then on the mood. I think sometimes you have to tackle the two simultaneously in order to progress through recovery. So I guess if your mood, or if you feel like your mood is holding you back in recovery, then if you have the privilege to access treatment, to access a psychiatrist, then it would be worth exploring that. But also just having someone to support you and who believes your story and believes in your ability to recover is really priceless. And that's something else that my psychiatrist really gave me, is that he believed me when other people hadn't before, and that in itself was huge, because I'd sort of felt like I was crazy, because that's kind of the way that I felt I was being treated before that. And so even if it's not a psychiatrist but just a family member or a friend or someone in the recovery community who believes you and supports you and knows that you can recover, having their faith in your ability is hugely valuable. And definitely, if you are watching this video, I have faith in you that you can recover as well, because just by watching this video, especially to this point, you show a huge amount of commitment. If there are people, if you do come across people who don't believe in your experiences, then I want to remind you that you know you the best of anyone. You will have a sense of what you need to get better, and you deserve to have those things to make your recovery easier, because recovery is so tough, and whatever we can do to make it easier is worth it. You don't have to suffer through emotional misery and the misery of an eating disorder. I truly believe that you can recover from them both. Okay, I'm gonna finish recording now. I hope you're keeping safe and well, and I'm sending you lots of love, and I'll record again soon. Bye.